Welcome back, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, and I figure we should get started. Welcome to session or panel 3, Breaking the Table. And just like always, we will go up in the order that the schedule has it, and I will try to keep time for everyone. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. If you post them in Discord, I will try to keep up and mark where they are. So without further ado, up first is Eddo Stern with a slight change in the title of their paper. It is now Asymmetrical Play in Capital and War.
Great. Let's see. Start. All right. Hi. Thanks. Excited to be here, especially on the particular panel called Breaking the Table. I have a good accidental pun coming up soon. Involves breaking and tables. Yeah, and sorry for changing the topic of my talk a little bit. I kind of went with the flow. This is where I ended up. So let's see. I'll introduce myself. I'm Eddo Stern. I teach in the Design Media Arts department at UCLA, and I'm the director of the UCLA Game Lab, which is an experimental interdisciplinary game lab. We make games mostly, but we also think about games critically and do all kinds of stuff. If you're interested in what the lab does, you can check it out. Apropos, we've been building a experimental role-playing games library this past few years, so that's been pretty exciting thing to share. And there's a picture of an analog ball making workshop we did in the lab earlier in the spring that Carlin Wing organized. So I'm going to jump into this talk, which is about how game design uses asymmetry or unfairness in different ways, and a specific focus on sort of Monopoly variants and war games. And I'll introduce some of my projects within context and talk about this. So first of all, I'll talk about balancing asymmetry. Generally, asymmetry, or the idea of balance, is seen as a sort of a virtuosic use of game design. It's a feat, take an asymmetrical system and make it balanced. Kind of shining example is Netrunner or Nice, where you have very different game mechanics pitted against each other, and there's this effort to make balance work within an asymmetrical system. Analog games specifically being typically multiplayer, balance is usually an unquestioned goal. You want multiplayer games to be balanced in order to be well designed, whereas single player games, more often than not digital games, they're not beholden to balance as a game design value. You can have, typically a very powerful player sort of plowing through the game, or, really difficult games which feel unbalanced versus the player, and they become usually, either ways of empowering the player to feel mighty, or challenge the player to also feel mighty by overcoming difficulty. So again, back to analog games. So Netrunner Netrunner and Nice is an example of this sort of feat of a pretty well balanced game, even though narrative-wise, and this is what I'll talk about in this talk as well, is the relationship between balance, asymmetry to narrative and to polemics. So Netrunner, for instance, within its asymmetry, it's not just difference. There's clearly an underdog hacker or a runner versus a sort of overdog corp. And this potential for an underdog defeating a overdog is built into the tension of the game, but it is all couched within a balanced system that has this asymmetry on a narrative side. That's an interesting sort of feature of Netrunner, this narrative imbalance in a way, side by side with game mechanics balance. What I'm interested in talking about more is unbalanced play as polemics. So cases where, in this case, board games are deliberately breaking the rules of good game design in order to make a polemical point, say something about the world. So these examples are fairly well known to some, and I'll show them in a minute. So unbalanced or unfair play is usually an accidental or an incidental byproduct of design and complexity. It's meant to be balanced, but it's not. But it can also be used deliberately as a polemical game design tool. So deliberately making a game, quote unquote, broken or unbalanced. So I'll show quickly two examples for context. So Blacks and Whites is a game from the 70s. That uses asymmetry and broken game mechanics in a sense, and to show social, political, racial imbalance around real estate, around different issues. So one of the kind of moments where you see this the most clearly is there in number 2 on the right of the directions. Basically, this point where you start with a different amount of money. So if you are a Black player, playing as a Black player, you get $10,000 and each white player gets $1 million. So this idea that kind of symmetry and balance and fairness are already broken as far as the game mechanics go, but they are serving a polemical role in this game. And then to flip sort of to the dark side here, this game, Public Assistance, which is sort of a right-wing propaganda game from the 80s, basically an anti-welfare state game, sets up another imbalanced, unfair playing fields to make its point. Why bother working for a living is their slogan. And when you play this game, you can quote unquote play fairly, get a job, do everything you're supposed to do as a capitalist citizen, or you can go on welfare and take shortcuts. And the game sort of sets up this tension of a fair play and unfair play within the game mechanics, but all to make their political point. Jumping on to the next phase, and I'll introduce one of the games I designed, Monopolies, Asymmetrical and Physical Labor. So this again is a pretty well-known, well-documented historical artifact, the landlord game, the socialist origins, which eventually became Monopoly, started as a game with clearly a polemical point of view, being critical of capitalism, and then co-opted by game companies and turned into a sort of parody of capital or a celebration of capitalism, and is symmetrical when you play Monopoly and the landlord game as well. This is a game I developed called Money Making Workshop in 2012. It does have a broken table, so there's my pun. The table has a big hole in the middle, which I had to break. And in this game, the more you play, the game creates this sort of pile of detritus underneath it, this pile of waste. And it's a example of what I was talking about, a deliberately asymmetrical, unbalanced, unfair game, which conveys the polemical point of view of this game. Just some screenshots of some fairly disinterested players, some more examples of gameplay, which involves physical making and physical labor by some of the players. To give a very quick overview, let me just check my time. Okay. There are a lot of physical components in this game. It's a pun on money making workshop, of course, and players produce money. Those who work physically produce money, and one player manipulates the money in order to generate money on top of this physical labor. And an outline of the 4 characters. So the way the game starts, there's a kind of psychological profile quiz given to each player. They fill it out, and based on that, they're assigned one of these roles. So one player plays as the ne'er-do-well, who basically participates in capital, but it's not too happy about it. Basically cheers on, but also sort of resents the system, but has to work and produce ingots. There's the enthusiast, who is sort of a cheerleader for the other workers and amplifies everybody's production. And there's the opponent, who is sort of an anti-capitalist, who can ultimately destroy the game, but it's very hard for them to do so, and they also have to work. Most of their cards, you can see, are work cards, but they have this one card to destroy the pot of gold. And then finally, you have the asymmetrical player, who plays as the genius, who doesn't manufacture any ingots, but manipulates the capital as it's created. Their guidelines, for instance, are tips for success: keep the crown full, keep morale high all around, consider the threats all around you, understand the numbers, play the numbers, forecast, avoid bad ingots, and anti-gold. And their game mechanics are quite different. They create, but also by sewing, but it's a little more fine motor skills labor than the other player workers. They create these different probability dice, which they, so like origami papercraft, and basically gamble on the pot against themselves. So they create these different schemes, and then they can roll them and cash out. And that's a quick overview of Money Making Workshop. Just as an example of using asymmetry within a game and really sacrificing kind of the value of game balance for this polemics. Continuing along that theme, this is another asymmetrical game, which is a sort of live performance LARP. It was a one-time event. It happened in the Media Archaeology Festival in Houston. And this is very similar theme, one player, but it is related to technology in this context. So one player, which was me, performing as a wizard on top of a tower, sort of rallies and demands that the audience work and produce gold by physically mining gold in this production line. And then there's a story arc. They don't produce enough gold typically, and the wizard punishes them, and they eventually rebel against the wizard. But again, the physical labor is performed here by the masses, and the wizard basically clicks buttons on a computer to manipulate them. I'll show you a quick video so you can, I'll kind of scrub through it.
People.
So it's a very short video of what is a 2.5 hour long performance, and sort of endurance elements of it are very key. So there is a kind of form of real physical exhaustion and labor, and continuing to play and get exhausted. And one character doesn't do that at all. That's part of the unfairness of that game. And I'll switch to sort of the second part of this talk, which is mythologies of asymmetrical warfare, talking about asymmetry and unfairness in war and war games. Just a little bit of context, and this kind of shifts up into some computer games and hybrid performance-based games. So asymmetry as empowerment in games. So the games Under Ash and Under Siege, made in Syria by Palestinian refugees, sort of take the framework of a first-person shooter, a US-made first-person shooter, and invert it, and you play as a Palestinian kid or adult using slingshots and analog tools against tanks and soldiers. And this asymmetry, sort of couched with playing within, sort of playing an underdog, it's really, I think, polemically meant to be an empowering tool for youth and young adults to play this game in the context of both the real politics and the game industry's narratives, which are very dominantly pro-Western, but also, I think this is maybe a very important point, they also present this illusion of an underdog. You'll play as a single sort of soldier against many, many powerful terrorists, say. So there's an inversion that is very cynical in that model, where the underdog is sold to the overdog as a narrative over and over. And we see this in almost across the board in US entertainment, the kind of anti-corporate narratives coming from every Disney movie, et cetera. So a kind of persistent underdog narrative as something everyone wants to feel.
Over time.
So sorry.
One last takeaway, and then you can, take this to Discord, or we can continue the conversation.
Okay. Sorry about that. So false underdogs, asymmetrical warfare. I was just going to mention Vietnam Romance, which is a game I developed, which again tries to challenge this notion, which you see also in Vietnam War movies and games, of the soldier individual against kind of the narrative of the underdog. And in Vietnam Romance, it's based in some ways on Larry Heinemann's Close Quarters, which doesn't allow that to happen. The soldiers are all inside of an armored personnel carrier. They never leave. So they are actually embodied in the machine, and they don't get to kind of realize this sort of individual underdog hero. And these are just pictures from, and I'm wrapping up, these are just pictures from Vietnam Romance, where you're always in the armored personnel carrier. So that's that.
Thank you so much. We can put links to all of these in the chat so that people can take a look at them. Up next is Mark Hines with the presentation entitled Boss Fight, the Real and Symbolic Mechanics of Role-Playing Games. Take it away.
Oh, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. All righty, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and go ahead and get started, because I feel like I might be a little bit close to going over myself. This talk, which I have changed to more clearly focus on Dimension 20's Unsleeping City, their third season. This talk utilizes political theory to analyze a persistent trope in speculative media, and especially games. I hope that my talk might give folks a framework and some resources to think about the political themes of our game. Is my screen on? There we go. Sorry about that, y'all. I don't know why that clicked off. All righty, we'll try this again. In keeping with our panel's title, Breaking the Table, I'm thinking about how our tables might come to break the whole political process or vice versa. And to do so, I'm focusing on depictions of the big bad evil guy in games, a banal convention, a trope that I think has deep consequences for players that we sometimes overlook. Sometimes in our worlds, not only is the final boss the monarch or some president, right? But they're also the biggest, baddest person in all the land. I argue that players and audiences of speculative works can assuage their own political concerns for democracy by engaging in this dynamic. And to illustrate this dynamic, I'm going to talk about a particularly demonstrative example, Dimension 20's usage of Robert Moses in its third season, The Unsleeping City. As literary scholars of the speculative have known for some time, the speculative is a place where political meaning is both reflected and constructed, not a place where political meaning is absent. Game scholarship has a rich tradition of analyzing representations of the, quote, real world, unquote, particularly with regards to race and gender. I want to examine a common, easily overlooked trope that we build many of our worlds upon. And to do so, I'm going to be talking about boss monsters. And for me, I'm talking about boss monsters who wield not only personal power, but political or systemic or institutional power as well. And to do so, I'm going to use the term locus or loci of power. I borrowed this term from a characterization of Claude Lefort, the political theorist, and I hope that this term aptly comes to describe the complicated ways in which monarchs and politicians in our speculative games accumulate power. Magically, socially, physically, technologically, systemically, in all ways. Functionally, such figures serve as an almost teleological justification for the player character's actions, often violent in overcoming their authority. Basically, a locus of power holds political or systemic power and is the biggest, baddest figure in all the land. This status often figures the locus of power as an abject representative of their political faction. No character could be more representative of the Empire than Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars or Strahd from Barovia, to give a Dungeons and Dragons example. I argue that the locus of power serves as a narrative shorthand whereby audience and player anxieties about the transfer of power in a democracy can be eased. The audience or player isn't supposed to worry about the galactic power vacuum when the Death Star is destroyed, for example. This trope serves more than just narrative purposes, though. In arguing that superhero genres construct as well as reflects American political thought, Jason Dittmer argues that the genre functions as a, quote, discourse through which the world becomes understandable, unquote. My argument is that this trope not only assists players and audiences in understanding the world, but I argue that the trope eases anxieties innate to life in a democracy. In essence, though the political systems of speculative games might be far different from our own, idealizing and fantasizing about power in such a way affords players cathartic opportunities. This sense is more than just a nostalgia for the medieval or feudal, but a desire for political agency, legitimacy, and symbolic order in ways that life in a democracy can often feel unsatisfying, right? Despite our expressed desires for egalitarian representation, mechanically and symbolically representing this urge is very difficult. Dana Nelson reads this dynamic into the growing power wielded by the executive branch in the United States, calling it, quote, presidentialism, the mesmerizing power of presidentialism. The way we look to the sitting president for national strength and unity encourages citizens to believe that their democratic agency depends on presidential power instead of the other way around, unquote. The logic of presidentialism leads to Dark Brandon memes and sword-wielding pictures of Donald Trump, and it points us to contradictory, incompatible ideas for the role. Quote, democratic connection and recognition, unquote, and avenging protector from the president. Just as the competing ideals of presidentialism describes contradictory impulses under democracy, The locus of power trope encourages players to idealize a simpler understanding of power and power transfers than democracy often affords. As these relations are often figured symbolically and psychologically, it is urgent to understand how the shift from despotic societies to democratic ones rendered the relationships between bodies and power more fraught. Claude Lefort's work assists in drawing attention to the precise characteristics of this new arrangement. As opposed to clear bodies, dimensions, and structures of power in a democracy, Lefort characterizes the locus of power as an empty place. That is to say, compared to a king or despot who holds real and symbolic authority, the relationship of person to power in a democracy becomes much more difficult to articulate. By dissimulating control to a majority of the voting population, the society is left without a viable symbol for unity, control, and authority. Now, it's important to say that I'm not necessarily saying that this is always an anti-democratic thing, but I'm saying that when we use this trope, it is a way to relieve that tension where we at once want that unifying symbol, but can't necessarily have it in a democracy, right? Lefort discusses the problematic results of this lack of a relationship that we might figure medieval societies having to the king, for example. Quote, "It represents the outcome of a controlled contest with permanent rules. This phenomenon implies an institutionalization of conflict," unquote. Lefort elucidates this point later, writing, quote, "Division is, in a general way, constitutive of the very unity of society," unquote. Lefort would say that we have constructed democracy on the premise that we cannot be united, that we are always to be disagreeing with each other and fighting internally, and so we will lack that symbolic authority or order. In this way, democratic societies' foundational premises rely upon internal conflict, debate, and disagreement. This is often heralded as a unifying value of American life, but it also leads to continuing unresolvable issues always bound up in ideological debate. This describes an epistemological uncertainty, which he views as characteristic to democratic societies. In expanding Lefort's work, Santner discusses the flesh, a symbolic concept which illustrates the troubled relationship of bodies to power in democracy. Santner proposes a definition of flesh which utilizes its connotations of being hidden from sight while expanding it to a shared sensation. Basically, the flesh is a symbolic biopolitical relationship between powers and bodies, and the transfer of societies from monarchical or aristocratic to democratic carried with it a migration of the royal flesh. Basically, when the king was in charge, way back when, or at least the way we think about there being a king, the king had two bodies, according to Santner. The king's two bodies were at once physical, their physical personage, and the symbolic authority which they wielded. If it's helpful, think of the Thomas Hobbes image of the Leviathan, where the monarch is made up of all of the people that the monarch is supposed to represent and control, right? But if the king's second body was always that of the social political function, encompassing and defining the polis, then what became of that first body? If the king's first body, his unified political authority, was dispersed among the people, I'm wondering what form it took, if any. These troubling questions are what brings about the speculative locus of power. The trope functions as a means by which players can fantasize and appreciate clear, demarcated political roles characterized by hierarchies and immediate, apparent allegiance. The common semiotics of speculative games and media, usually shown through heraldry, insignias, physical features, or even race sometimes, imply unambiguous political loyalties for all characters, so players and audiences don't have to fret about ideological debate or disagreement. Rather, a license to kill is often implied, if not given outright. The locus of power allows us to ignore the complicated patterns of bodies, knowledge, and power in democracies. It is a filtration of the charismatic leader through a speculative lens in a way that generates impactful meaning for players and audiences. And with this framework, I'll turn to Dimension 20's depiction of Robert Moses with some of our theoretical backings under us, I hope. In The Unsleeping City, Dimension 20's third actual play series of Dungeons & Dragons, the intrepid heroes act as powerful figures in a magical version of New York City. The series sees them attend trendy art shows, skirmish against a giant rat in the New York City sewers, and discern the arcane meaning behind Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, which marks the Statue of Liberty. The many threads and mysteries of this actual play eventually converge at Robert Moses's insidious plans to gain and secure power. Moses intends to summon and concretize the very idea of the American dream, transforming it from a nebulous ambition of the masses into a firm reality, only achievable by rich white men. Democratically speaking, there is a lot at stake this season. Emma French rightly points out how magic is paradoxically representative of disenchantment in this campaign. And I want to focus how this disenchantment is symbolically represented by Moses and argue that overcoming such a challenge is a decidedly political process at our tables, even and especially when we forget that it is happening. Brennan Lee Mulligan's choice of the character of Robert Moses is certainly not one absent of political meaning. The real-life Robert Moses led a public life far too notable and infamous for this presentation, but I hope that it suffices to say that the real-world Moses is an excellent example of how undemocratic our democracy can sometimes be. Criticism of Moses as an undemocratic and harmful city planner are largely traced back to the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography by Robert A. Caro, The Power Broker. Moses held at a time 12 titles simultaneously, none of them elected, but many of them with massive control of state and city funds with little to no oversight. In the game, Moses architects the Highway Hex, a means of controlling which magical entities are allowed to enter New York City. This is a direct reference to criticism of the real-world Moses's use of city and state funds to construct highways and road systems, which often destroyed neighborhoods of people of color and the poor, in addition to isolating them from parks and pools. In a conversation with Lou Wilson's Kingston Brown, the Vox Populi, or the voice of the people in the campaign, Brennan Lee Mulligan, through the voice of Moses, says, "People think they make choices. They think they're going to steer right or steer left, but they didn't build the roads. The big choices already got made for them a long time ago." Brennan Lee Mulligan's interpretation and portrayal of Moses sync up nicely with my characterization of the locus of power. Not only does Moses wield institutional and political control, but he is also a powerful lich, capable of powerful magic and altering the arcane reality of the player characters. Interestingly, Robert Moses ends up not being the final confrontation of the unsleeping city. Instead, the player's final encounter asks them to use arcane means to grant the American dream qualities of amorphousness and subjectiveness, qualities which Moses would destroy as a means of concretizing his version of the American dream as ultimate and singular. At one point in the encounter, the American dream attempts to bribe Zach Oyama's character, Ricky Matsui, into laying down his arms. Ricky's response serves as a perfect distillation of the democratic themes of the season. Quote, "But that's just my dream, right? It's not anyone else's dream. There should be the potential for everyone to have a dream," unquote. Though the final combat of this season doesn't feature Moses, I think it's apropos that the intrepid hero's final act is to restore a democratic idea of the future and the purpose of life to the people of New York City. This season and the climactic episode are premised upon real people and real places, but I argue that this dynamic goes far beyond, even to decidedly unreal worlds. My point is not just that we like to fantasize about beating up authoritarians, even though it is pretty fun, but that the tensions and tumult of democracy is very difficult to capture mechanically and narratively. The shorthand allowed by the locus of power smooths player and audience concerns about transitions of power, power vacuums, and complicated political dynamics which would naturally follow the violent overthrow of a despot or monarch. This trope and the violence which accompanies it allows players and audiences a guilt-free, low-stakes engagement with machinations of power. I'm going to leave us with a quote from the University of Kentucky's own Michelle Sizemore's work, American Enchantment, where she discusses a striking image from Rousseau's social contract. In it, Rousseau criticizes images of the popular sovereign as a being of fantasy, composed of separate pieces, which would be like putting a man together from several bodies, one having eyes, another arms, another feet, nothing more, unquote. The use of the locus of power is often inconsistent, muddled, and messy, but it points to audiences' recurring desire to engage the political process, even in strange and abstract ways. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Great. Again, if you have questions, put them in Q&A. All right, up next is PS Berge with the Ludoarsonist playground, doom clocking and the ends of the table. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Chang, and thank you, Mark. Let me get everybody situated so I can see the chat. Okay, everyone can see the thing?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Well, hello, nerds. I'm P.S. Berge. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Central Florida, and this is my talk, The Ludoarsonist Playground, Doom Clocking and the Ends of the Table. I'm so glad to be sharing this here because it was actually at last year's Generation Analog during a Q&A that I was given a question about positioning queerness within the transphobic logics of Dungeons & Dragons. And in response, I said somewhat offhandedly that I was disinterested in conciliatory fixes to D&D and that, quote, I'm coming to see myself as a kind of Ludoarsonist. And the chat had quite a bit of fun with that term and even coerced me into putting it into my Twitter bio. But now, a year later, surprise, it's not just a bit. It's actually become the cornerstone of my dissertation work on unraveling game systems through play. So, a quick overview. There are two ways we might read Ludoarsony. Firstly, it is to burn the game, to liberate play from fixed categories and from the game's own bounded materiality. We're going to be talking about this a lot today, setting your games on fire. Yet it can also be read as Ludoarson, to play with fire, to find play in the burning, unmediating, and unplaying of games. So to broadly summarize, I'm interested in play that makes the game no longer a game, what we might call the unplayable. We might take joy in the ash and burnt cardboard. We might become a new kind of player, become Ludoarsonists. So with that, I have some bad news. The end of gaming is upon us. And to be fair, this is far from the first time. Gaming, it seems, is always ending, and gamers are always mourning its loss. Casualization, the rise of mobile games, DRM software, the satanic panic, microtransactions, Fortnite, inflation, scapegoating for gun violence, emulation, loot boxes, and of course, Gamergate, we might lose count of all the times that gaming has met its tumultuous end. And Catherine Cross, in her excellent analysis of Gamergate, describes the gamer's disposition towards melodramatic doomsaying and existential panic as a terror dream. As she writes, gamer love must be a reactive thing, forever under outside threat. Protecting against these threats or opposing them has become part of the very practice of being a gamer. And this is not unique to video games. Last year, I talked about reactionary movements within the D&D fandom and how Ernie Gygax provoked a wave of toxic messaging after making claims that old school players were being run out of tables for being old-fashioned and not understanding gender identity. And Gygax's bitter lamentations, his faux reluctant defensiveness, and his fantastical nostalgia are all part and parcel of the terror dream of gaming. Such is the tragedy of the capital G gamer, a life of bitter, grim-faced vigilance against the swirling threat of the inevitable. But maybe, just maybe, the end of gaming isn't a bad thing. A couple of months ago, popular gaming magazine Polygon tweeted an article with the tagline, "The opposite of grimdark is hope punk, and tabletop RPGs are leading the way forward to a more optimistic future for the hobby and humanity." And in response to the article, however, Brazilian TRPG designer Wendy Yu tweeted a thread of frustrations about her game's inclusion under the label of hope punk. Yu noted that this was a mischaracterization of their work, as what is often described as hope punk plays into, quote, a bourgeois escapist fantasy that trades an actual understanding of our context for an empty vibe of wholesomeness, tenderness, kindness, and shit like that. As they went on to argue, we don't need hope punk's type of hope in our grim dark times. We need to burn the world down because we hope whatever we build in the ashes is not just a rehash of what came before. That's what my game is about. The end of the world is a good thing, the beginning of something else. And what Yu describes here is a sharp articulation of what gender radical and abolitionist feminists have been saying for some time. First is that hope is a promissory techno-utopian tool that encourages somnolence and ignores material conditions. Trans scholars, for example, have pointed out that the "it gets better" narrative used by gay suicide prevention charities circumvent the reality that it only gets better for some, and its passivity suggests that one might wait patiently for this always oncoming betterment. Instead, feminist scholars have articulated experiences of an active longing that is also an ushering in of the world after this one. And so our question then becomes, how do we find, as Hill Malatino writes, a way of making space to think, to be in worlds that are unlivable, but that one must nevertheless persist to exist within? And this is my project here, to find life in the unlivable and to find play in the unplayable. If reactionary gaming fandoms are rife with doomsayers, then Ludoarsonists might be called the doom bringers. The Ludoarsonist not only embraces, but ushers in the end, unsealing the seals, sparking the fire, and pressing every big red button that might hurry this thing along until it's all ablaze. Marquise Bay argues that taking hold of the world through the dictates of Black trans feminism, in effect, ends the world in order to claim the world, a world emerging from the rubble of this one anew in order for something that used to be us to live. The Ludoarsonist seeks the end of gaming for the same reasons they seek the end of gender, to liberate play from the grip of these twin phantoms. Their feminist position comes from their role as a celebrant of the apocalypse. So with that, let's find our matches. I first started studying burning games over a year ago while working on a paper about the Mörkborg Zine community. And for those who don't know, it's a Swedish death punk role-playing game that takes place in a despairing sludge metal utopia. Sorry, dystopia. But what I'm interested in is its unique endgame mechanic. In Mörkborg, every dawn the player rolls to see if the world draws closer to its inevitable end. And anytime a 1 is rolled, a new prophetic misery of the apocalypse is unleashed upon the earth. And once the 7th misery is rolled, well, the world ends, all of the characters die, the game and your lives end here. Burn the book. And that might be read as hyperbole, but it isn't. Fans frequently share photos and videos of the burning text. And as I wrote last year, while this might seem like a marketing scheme to get folks to buy more copies of the book, the ritualistic burning of the Mörkborg text can actually be read as a political act. Dungeon crawler TRPGs and fantasy genres, especially those in D&D's ludic genealogy, are often associated with costly books and rules lawyering. But Mörkborg playfully diminishes the significance of its own rules by inviting players to set it on fire. What happens when a game is made unplayable through burning? When the material reality, the coded nature, the textness, the authority, and the binding propensity of the ludic system is unraveled through burning. The game isn't gaming anymore when it's been burned away, but play lingers amidst the fire. Play is the fire. So let's turn to another example. Stephen Dewey's tragic horror game 10 Candles is its own take on ludoarsony, as it is a game that one plays by burning. I try to run it for my friends once a year around Halloween. We sit in a dark room around a flame-proof bowl and the titular 10 candles. This time around, I'm facilitating one of the book's classic scenarios. Characters have been hiding in a small bunker and decide to venture to an observatory in rural Oregon, where they last heard of other survivors. Before the game begins, I pass my phone around to players who take turns recording in-character messages about setting out. In 10 Candles, characters are made by writing their traits down on note cards and burning away these features to alter the fiction. The game consists of 10 scenes, the next scene beginning whenever a candle goes out. 10 Candles then facilitates a deliberate playing into darkness as the story becomes increasingly grim as characters come to face their inevitable ends. And players know from the get-go that their characters will die. In fact, this is one of the rules that Dewey is relatively hard-fisted about. It's not about whether the characters fall to the darkness or emerge as survivors. There are no survivors, not here. Everyone will die in the final scene without question or quarrel. 10 Candles guides play towards the moment after the game is over. At the start of each scene, as the GM, I lead the players in a ritual. I begin, "These things are true. The world is dark." And the players take turns going around the scene and setting truths about the game before responding together, "And we are alive." We play out the scenes of the characters' misadventure. Eventually, they make their way to an observatory and break inside to find it empty, but not entirely empty. And as the final candle flickers on the table, all of us know what's about to happen. One player immediately, dramatically sacrifices her character to save another survivor, granting that player a hope die. Another of my players is still trying to problem solve his way out of the inevitable. In the end, the survivor who received the hope die is the last one alive. She tries to hide and fails her role. And as the candle is snuffed and she perishes, the room falls into darkness. I then say my part. These things are true. The world is dark, but this time there is no speaking back. There are no truths. Instead, I discreetly press play on my phone and begin the recording. The voices of these characters now lost to us, their virtues and vices and moments and brinks burnt to ash in a bowl on the table in my friend's living room. Play again. I hope you can hear.
This is Gregory Bly. December 22nd, 2019. Results have been inconclusive at this station, and we're beginning to run out of resources. It's been decided that we'll move on, God knows where. I hope it'll make a difference. Maybe. This is stupid. I'm done.
I think we might be the last ones. The very last ones. And I don't want that to be true, so if you're listening to this, we tried.
The recorded voices are at once familiar and not. We hear these characters and know that they are not the same as they were when these messages were captured, nor are we the same players. And as the recording ends the game, 10 Candles is over, and a radical, devastating play, the sitting together in the darkness of it, erupts from the ashes. The unspoken words, "and we are alive," linger in the smoky air unuttered. As Dewey states in the guidebook, let them have that silence. This moment is what 10 Candles is all about. We sit in the moment after. The characters are dead, the story is done, and we are left with ash and the dark. And the silence hangs over us until one of my friends shakes their head and says, well, fuck, what should we play now? Both 10 Candles and Merkborg then represent burning games as a means of playing with the end. They invite a mournful reveling in the destruction, in the anticipation of the unmaking, morose and gleeful, as players cast their characters piece by piece into fire and post videos of their burning source books. This celebratory knowing that the burning is coming marks an orientation towards unending play. To quote Bay again, so burn it all, there's the gender we want. And here I'd say, burn it all, there's the game we want. At the end of the burned game, what we have left is the play, momentarily gameless, of sitting in the quiet dark together, feeling things together, holding and witnessing each other. This isn't hope punk, this is Ludoarsony. And as the final words of the final song of Morkborg's nameless scriptures intone, all praise the fire which burns all, and the darkness shall swallow the darkness. I really wish we had a little more time to talk about these things, but I made a mistake and pitched a 12,000 word dissertation chapter as a 15-minute talk. But speaking of wishes, there is one last thing I want to leave you with. There's a practice I'm fond of in role-playing games called Stars and Wishes, a role-playing ritual that belongs to no game, though many make use of it. The premise is that at the end of each session of play, the player grants a star to another player, shouting out a moment they really enjoyed, and each player makes a wish, something they hope to see in a future session. I bring up Stars and Wishes to highlight a practice made exemplary in role-playing games, taking time when the game is over to slip into the meta and become for a moment people observing and longing together. While Stars and Wishes is regarded as a safety tool and might be seen as merely facilitatory, granting stars and making wishes is also play and a kind of aftercare in Malatino's sense. We might imagine it and the practices I've articulated here of burning games and welcoming the end as doing the work of afterworld care, small hints at how we might keep living and playing in the world ablaze. So, in conclusion, set your games on fire. This is the play the Ludoarsonist is after. This is why the game and its attending logics, its bits of wood and cardboard and plastic, its collateral technocultural encampments, its corporocratic institutions, and its ontologizing systems all must burn. Gaming's defensiveness, its terror dream, imagines that play stops when the game stops. But this is a lie. The end of gaming is here, and when it's all been burned, and the game is truly over and these fires clear, we'll still be here under the stars, playing and wishing and living for the world we might make in the ashes of the game after. Play that holds our words unuttered in the air in mutual assurance, and we are alive. Thank you all so much for listening and for being so hype in the chat. Here's my email and my Discord handle because Twitter is dead. And as a subtle note, I'm going on the job market this year. So if you want me to come to your department and set games on fire, send me a note.
I just
Thank
made a
you.
joke today that, Twitter is dead earlier, and, but I refuse to let it go. And maybe the Twitter bird will actually be a phoenix and we'll get something different.
Oh, that would be fun.
Thank you so much. Last but not least is Alexander Carneiro with How to Break Out, Digital Crowdfunding Platforms and the Technological Bias Against Global South TTRPG Creators. Take it away.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm gonna be looking at my notes here. Hello, everyone, and I start play on my time. Thank you all for being here. I attended the last 2 editions of Generation Analog, and this year I was, finally able to submit an abstract, and I'm very happy to be here presenting it to you. My name is Alexander Carneiro. Carneiro means ship in English. I am a game studies researcher and professor of design and media production recently here in Brazil. And I'm going to present my research, How to Break Out, Digital Crowdfunding Platforms and the Technological Bias Against Global South TTRPG Creators. This research is a part of my current research interests that deal with creative work in digital platform spaces and the relations of power between workers and platforms. So I begin this presentation with a story. This is the real story of a Latin American author who decides to write a new TTRPG. The game is written in English in order to achieve an international market and have better chances of being consumed. Additionally, the author collaborates with others in order to increase their chances of success. And finally, they decide to create a crowdfunding campaign to help them with their goals. And that is when they are faced with an almost inevitable obstacle. Most international crowdfunding platforms do not allow creators from the Global South to start funding campaigns. Not Kickstarter, not Indiegogo, and not GoFundMe. Actually, this map shows in red the countries from which creators can start campaigns in Kickstarter. Every other country not in red, including Brazil, is not eligible. This lack of accessibility is reflected on the ecosystem of successful crowdfunded games. According to this spreadsheet made with information collected by the user Moros on the forum EN-Word, we can confirm that the 10 most successful companies in crowdfunding TTRPG campaigns come from the Global North, more specifically, the United States. Coincidentally, there is actually one company from Brazil, but in Kickstarter, they have to use an address from Delaware, USA. So what does this story and this spreadsheet tell us? Here, this research argues that the availability of creating and successfully finishing crowdfunding campaigns, despite their digital nature through online platforms, is not evenly distributed around the world. And when this lack of availability seems to follow economical and geopolitical borders, it starts to be definable as a possible bias against certain types of peoples and creators. It may seem more obvious to think that countries with more developed economies and a stronger tradition of tabletop games would tend to publish and successfully release more games. But this overoccurrence of Global North tabletop RPGs in successful crowdfunding campaigns is not merely linked to the economic and political privileges of such countries. It is also technological in nature, as we demonstrated. Creators residing in Global South simply cannot launch campaigns in the most known international crowdfunding platforms. This technical limitation imposed onto Global South creators is an added layer of difficulty when trying to break into either the independent or commercial market, TTRPG market, that is. But then we have to ask ourselves, regardless of any explanations these platforms can provide us for not including those countries, is this bias really purely technological? This research argues that although this limitation presents itself as technological, it is also entirely political. To support this argument, I bring two cases of Global South creators trying to engage in international crowdfunding platforms with varying degrees of success, and I further explore one particular practice of independent TTRPG creators in digital platforms, that which is known as itch funding. Some of you may know about it. I used the method of participant observation for more than a year in a collective of South American TTRPG designers, authors, and artists called RPG Latam. I gathered stories and experiences from creators who position themselves in the Global South. I also interviewed a number of creators and contextualized these experiences and stories through the conceptual lenses of both platform capitalism and digital colonialism. And I tell these three stories. This is RPG Latam, the collective of Latin American Global South TTRPG creators. The story I was telling in the beginning continues. The creators indeed are able to find an international crowdfunding platform that accepts works from their region. After a successful campaign comes the time to collect the money raised and start the production of the game. But due to a technical error, presumably during the currency conversion, the PayPal account was lost, the money was blocked, and many backers had their support cancelled, most of them from South America. In the end, the game did get finished, but with 19 backers less. The second story I tell is that of Latin Breakout, a success. There is a lot to talk about this phenomenon, but I will keep it to the facts. Latin Breakout is a collection of 5 games from Latin American creators that went in crowdfunding through Kickstarter. Some of these games and authors were already circulating in digital form in the international scene of indie TTRPGs. Organized by Soul Muppet RPG, which is the publisher, Soul Muppet serves not only as a platform for these creators, but also as a concrete possibility for these independent authors to crowdfund their games, since, as we demonstrated, Kickstarter do not allow projects from their countries. Latin Breakout was a success, was very well received. Wendy Yu, who was cited here, was a part of it. It catapulted these creators to an even bigger relevance in the international TTRPG scene. But the harder truth is that even when successful South American creators, South American creators still depended on the kindness of foreign actors and had to go through a more complex process of finding someone to give them this possibility of a crowdfunding campaign. This last story is less of a story and more of a current practice between independent TTRPG designers, a practice that involves subverting hard-coded technology to achieve goals that were not necessarily anticipated by the creators of such technology. Itch.io is a virtual marketplace for video games that is also widely used by the independent TTRPG community to sell and distribute their creations. Being unable to create crowdfunding campaigns in the main international platforms, creators use the temporary sales functionality on itch.io to simulate crowdfunding campaigns. By creating a sale on their games and setting a final date and an amount of raised money as a goal, the platform creates an interface that resembles that of a crowdfund. What happens here is that these authors are subverting the original intention of the platform to take advantage of this and enable their projects. This is how a regular each funding page would look like. The website displays this progress bar as how much of the goal was raised during the time set for the sale. But in reality, none of these follow the main characteristics of a crowdfunding campaign as we know it. Except for some creators, these are the closest thing available. To contextualize these three stories under the concept of digital colonialism, this concept needs to be briefly explained. Digital colonialism reminds us that corporations that manage the digital platforms offer their services globally, but are physically and legally placed in countries of the global north. When they extend their services into other countries, they find no need in observing local laws and needs and find little resistance against their operations, political resistance or structural resistance. Despite this lack of attention to local necessities, the populations of other countries still generate income for these companies. And when we view this context historically, it mirrors that of an updated and digital version of the practice of colonialism. The stories we heard are important because global north companies stretch into different countries and develop a relation with creators and workers. This worker platform relationship is never symmetric, but it's even more arbitrarily unbalanced when the worker in question lives in the global south. On the first story, the platform's limitations and currency conversion created stresses and almost had the whole project cancelled. On the second story, only a foreign actor made possible for Latin American creators to be showcased on the same environment as the most prestigious international creators. And on our third story, the Edge funding, we see an effort on the part of indie creators to take part in the international cycle of indie TTRPGs by subverting the very coded intentions of the digital platform's system. So what conclusions can we draw from these efforts? Though digital crowdfunding platforms do accept Global South inhabitants as clients, that is, backers, they do not accept them or view them as campaign creators. But creators find ways to overcome the effects of techno-political biases imposed by digital platforms. Sometimes this means transgressing the original intentions of designed technology in the case of each funding. Other times this means seeking support from people in condition to help who do not suffer from the same limitations. But in both cases, the techno-political discrimination creates specific situations to Global South creators that would not happen if they were from other geopolitical regions. And to finish this presentation, if we think of Kickstarter as a showcase of cool projects, then that showcase is being denied to a very large group of creators. We must look into the information and experiences available in the indie TTRPG scene and rethink our discussions about inclusion and accessibility in the TTRPG design hobby / profession, especially in our dealings with digital platforms. Thank you very much. Here I have my email and my Twitter, X, I don't know. Let's talk about this more on the chat and afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And a round of applause for everybody. Thanks to the folks that gave us a little bit of time back. That's awesome. So we have about 25 minutes to chat a little bit before we have our next break and the next keynote. So there are some questions already in Q&A. As far as I can tell, no direct questions have come up in the Discord, but if I'm wrong, please ping me there. So I'm just going to read these from Percival. They ask, This is for, looks like for Mark. Does the way locuses of power show up vary from genre to genre based on the conventions, types of stories told in those genres? Cyberpunk genres is what made me think of this, but I'm thinking broadly about what kind of worlds different genres invite and what worlds those look like politically. And if you need me to repeat that, just let me know.
No, I can see it. Thanks. That's
great.
an excellent question, one that I've been bouncing around a little bit myself. I actually first started thinking about this when I was playing Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance and thinking about Senator Armstrong and the way that he uses power, wealth, commonalities in the cyberpunk genre in order to mechanically enhance his own body through the use of nanobots and becomes nigh invincible. I'm also thinking for the cyberpunk genre, perhaps a character like Atom Smasher. But what's interesting about the trope, the locus of power, is when it's used, but also when it's subverted. And various genres are good at subverting it. I think cyberpunk is good at revealing the way that power is often held in the hands of individuals who are perhaps enfeebled or unable to mechanically orchestrate power in a way that benefits the masses, right? That's what cyberpunk is all about. Fantasy does it a little bit as well. But for a lot of these genres in gaming, the key thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to give the illusion of a power fantasy. And if, as I'm thinking through this, I'm thinking about power simply as the ability to enact violence without repercussions. That is all that it's trying to do. For that individual, for the locus of power, it's making visible what institutional power has always done, which is to do violence upon people without repercussions. And it is saying, let's give you other kinds of power. Let's give you magical power. Let's give you technological power. Let's give you physical power, make you very big and very strong. And so if we do that, then the violence of the system kind of becomes very manifest. And then what will you do with that as a hopeful hero, right? I hope that answers the question. It's a question I'm still trying to think through a lot myself.
I think what's really interesting is the tension between like the desire to, that power and fantasy control and wanting to win and save the world and all those things. And then all of these like games that a lot of the panelists have been talking about both now and previously about like games where you're never going to win. And, the world is going to end no matter what you do. And I think that's really, that tension I think is really interesting and how that might flip or deal with those sorts of issues. So I'm going to skip to a question to just sort of mix things up. So Joe asks, P.S. Doesn't any revolution just set up different sets of privileged and disenfranchised people, which is sort of related to what we were just talking about?
Yeah. No, thanks for that question, Joe. And I think, the answer is yes and no. But I think like the bigger question there is, can we ever like get there, right? Whenever you talk about, okay, we're going to burn the system down, like what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? And this is something I'm articulating as I work on my diss on Ludoarsony. And I have two thoughts here. One is that the idea of burning down like the institutional frameworks of gaming and sort of its broader ontologies is always going to be aspirational, right? This is the entire second case study of my dissertation, but looking specifically at how games ossify, how gaming cultures harden and then become defensive. Even newly emerging, once radical, once really disruptive game spaces can become exclusionary and toxic over time. Like that's a process that happens. And so like the framework that I'm interested in teasing out Ludoarsony is like, how do we always be burning? How can we always be burning these things as they emerge? And we end up sort of caught in this state of cyclical like capture and escape. I'm thinking a lot about Aaron's new book. I should specify one of Aaron's new books, Repairing Play specifically. But I will also say the other thing that I'm thinking about a lot here is the way that trans scholars write about coalitional feminism, right? Particularly, I would refer you to the works of Cameron Awkward Rich and Cale Keegan. They talk a lot about how coalition leaves no one feeling great, right? There is a messiness to the like act of coming together in an attempt to rupture systems, and like not everyone is going to feel happy, not everyone is going to feel good about that. And obviously this talk is an abbreviated version of my larger chapter, but that's one of the reasons why I turn to burning games here, because when we set our games on fire, or as I talk about later in the chapter, we kill off our characters, we destroy our worlds, we end our campaigns, like there's a lot of mixed feelings with that. There's sort of a, wait, I was really attached to that. Wait, this is like upsetting and emotional, but also exciting for the reasons that I explored today. So all that to say, yes, like inherently so, but that's why like finding a way to position sort of our feminist methodologies that is like conscious of that is so important. I really hope that answers the question.
Great. As people are talking, and you know, as a good moderator, I always try to find a through line. And I do think there are resonances among folks. And this is, I'm stalling for time so people can ask more questions. There's one more in the Q&A, but I might pose this question to everybody, because all of you talk about you know, breaking the table or upending systems or trying to find ways to, you know, reconfigure, destroy, rebuild, you know, all that sort of stuff. And maybe relate it to Eddo's talk about asymmetrical play, right? Thinking about like, you know, when you fight a boss in a game, isn't the game already set up for you to beat that boss, right? Like, so like it's asymmetrical in a sense, right? Because we know you're going to win. Or what about those games where you're like, you're never going to beat the boss? That's also asymmetrical in a way. And then we could balloon that out, obviously, to politics, to polemics, to, you know, capitalist systems, to fundraising. Like, I don't know. Speak as people type good questions.
I mean, I don't know where this, I don't know historically if there's an origin point, but it seems like the whole Dark Souls games introduce this possibility of really not winning these games, these very mainstream kind of top of the line AAA games that are just pretty much, nope, you're not going to do it. It's going to be a kind of, you know, a real dystopia for the gamer where you just give up and you feel sad. And I think, I don't know, I feel that's a really pretty, I don't know, kind of a paradigm shift, I think, in thinking about games for a lot of people, where there's this possibility of not being able to do it.
Other thoughts, or we can come back to that. Yeah, there's a lot of, you know, current writing about permadeath games, and permadeath games then also imply like perma-life games, right? Like, you know, all these sorts of things, thinking about Bo Ruberg's work and other folks. So from Nick to Mark, do you feel that the license to kill offered by many games, as you call it, is connected to many games' figuration of the locus of power as dictator monarch-like figure, i.e. does concentrating power in a single, often superhuman body invite violence as a response?
That's a wonderful question. I think I assumed when I was working through this that a lot of these locus and loci of power would be portrayed to be the ultimate antagonist, right? Not just the most powerful being in the land, but also the most abject representation of everything wrong in a decaying system, in a decaying empire that enacts overt and covert violence against people, right? And so that by eliminating this single threat, you don't have to go about the messy process of voting people out and going through committees and navigating bureaucracies. That wouldn't necessarily make for the most fun gameplay, or maybe it would. But I think that our reliance on using the locus of power, or concentrating all these different kinds of power into one body, demonstrates the fact that a lot of us are longing for a world that has more clearly demarcated political options, or more clearly demarcated, or a way to signify progress in a way that is not so messy, or a way that divides politics in a way that we can't even symbolically understand, because the variety of opinions and the nuance of human life is difficult to understand inherently. And so we long for a simplistic way to understand it. Violence is unambiguous, at least interpersonal violence is often unambiguous. Discourse is complicated, is what I would say. But thank you, that's an excellent question.
This question is from Game RT Roundtable for Alexander. As a librarian, I try to build diverse gaming collections. Do you have any additional resources to find creators from the Global South that are left out of the platforms that you talk about?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. There are some lists on each IO created and curated by these same Global South, South American also creators. I can link them on Discord, but that's the thing. Even those kinds of games that are made by creators who perceive themselves as Global South and create these games as part of this identity are still made with a certain market in mind, that is to sell the Global South to the Global North, because Global North people are those who can afford those games in a way that makes it feasible for these creators to see this hobby as a kind of profession, or a barely lucrative for them in terms of paying for their work. But there may be some grassroots initiatives here in Brazil or South America that I may not have heard about, but I do believe that a good point of start is those lists on each IO that I can link on Discord. And I also wanted to address a question made by Daedalus. I think, have any of the main platforms explained why they are only available in pretty much United States and Anglophone world and Europe? I have tried to contact those platforms, sending them emails. Basically, only Indiegogo has responded to me, and they basically just requoted the page that says that these countries are not available, and we only have services for campaign creation on these countries. They do not explain, they do not give any kind of reason for that. I do believe that it is tied to payment processing and international sending and receiving of money, but it doesn't explain why we can send money to the Global North, but the Global North cannot send money to the Global South. And it also doesn't explain why some other smaller platforms for crowdfunding can receive project creations from the Global South, as I put in the presentation.
Thank you, Alexander, for catching that question on Discord. Okay, let's see. Oh, lots. All right, let's go. PS, this is from Anonymous. Have you worked with children in gaming spaces? What would you imagine it look like to burn our games with kids in a safe space context?
Yeah, this is a really fun question. I feel like, I don't know, legally, I shouldn't give you advice on setting things on fire near children. I'll say two things here though, really quick. I actually relatively recently was thinking about this specific thing, in that, like, because there are a handful of games that involve burning as a part of play, 10 Candles being the quintessential example. There's not a lot in terms of like games for kids that involve burning. And a part of me thinks that's just because kids are great at destroying their own games anyway. They probably don't need any further encouragement. But one of the things that I think is really really fun to think about with kids specifically is the way that they already take the components of the game and like reimagine them in the ways that can give them the most destructive power. My partner has a 7-year-old cousin, and I ran tabletop RPGs for them for the first time a couple of months ago, and we did safety tools at the beginning, like what are the things you don't want to see in the world, what are the things you do, and immediately the 7-year-old is like, I don't want eyes in the world. Nobody here has eyes anymore, or hair. Everyone in this world now has no eyes and is bald. Anyway, I say that all to say that yeah, kids need no encouragement to take games and break them.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about us, playing myself and, usually taking a board game, for example, and then not playing it the way it's supposed to be played, or taking pieces from one game and adding them to another, I think is
Yeah.
really, really lovely. Or even just breaking them anyway to break them. I'm going to jump to Danny's question. I've been thinking Eddo's notion of asymmetry alongside Berge's Ludoarsonist imperative. Arsony, of course, is destructive technique in the face of incommensurate forms of power. Wondering how many of these asymmetrical games might instead end with burning down, polemic landlord games, say, among many featuring systemic inequities. I'm fascinated by forms of conclusion that require total destruction, like a validated rage quit or the valor of tilt, given an impossible situation. I guess I'm curious on how you both think about these models as determined by the ends of the game and what forms of power they require.
I don't know if I can answer that very directly, but I feel like there's something about destruction in general being such a fundamental sort of form of agency in a lot of games. The idea of that there's building games which we have a certain mode and tenor to them, and then a lot of games are really about tearing things down, and that joy of just whether you're raiding a dungeon or just blowing something up or kind of having just the joy of even just physics. Breaking a wall is a very different experience than building a wall. So I don't know, I'm thinking about it in that sense of arson or destruction as a kind of already almost a kind of, it's part of the game loop in a way, is how I think of it in a lot of cases. And when you burn it all down, there's nothing left to destroy anymore. So, and it needs to be like rebuilt so you can smash it again, something like that. That's where my head went.
I do want to note that arson is specifically as a term, isn't it? It's a legal term, right? Like it's a juridical term, because you can set fire to something without it being arson, for example. So I think there's something interesting play with the language there. Okay, maybe if we have time, you can sort of clarify on what is that thing called? Discord. Okay, let's jump back up to the top. This is from Brian, kind of a half-formed question for PS. I'm interested in what seems like a tension between your term Ludoarson and the ways that burning is actually contained within the game systems of Berge, 10 Candles, so on and so forth. Can games themselves be Ludoarsonists, or does the recapture of arson within Ludo undercut its potentials? Great.
I super appreciate this question, Brian. And the answer is yes. I This was a big problem actually in first scaffolding out my dissertation work, because the most immediately obvious games are the ones that invite their own unmaking, right? And in the chapter, I actually situate 10 Candles in Morkborg within a much broader categorization of games that demand their own unmaking. So legacy games are a great example where you destroy the game in the process of playing it. But on the virtual side, we have self-deleters like Doki Doki Literature Club and Inscription that delete their own save data when you beat them, right? Like there's a whole host of games where to play them is to unmake them. Now, I would also argue that there are ways to play games that unmake them even when they're not asking for it. It's just that these games in particular offer a really exemplary demonstration of this kind of play. So for me, like it's important to clarify that these kinds of games are exemplary, not exceptional. And I think that kind of gets at what you're saying. I don't think that that's a like a pacification of that radicality. I think it's just an example of like those designers were like, here, have an arbitrary rule system, and then in the process of playing through it, that system is unraveled. I think games themselves can be sort of showcase their own unplayability. One other example I would give of that just really quickly, World Ending Game by Everest Pipkin. It's a edited collection, and I think a really good example, it's like an anthology of 20 to 30 different ways to end your ongoing campaign, right? So like that's a really good example of coming from the other side. You have something that's ongoing, you're playing this game with friends, and now you have a giant like arsenal of different ways by which you can blow up that world, end the game, and stop playing. Yeah, I hope that answers that.
Yeah, there's something about when a game lets you destroy it as opposed to you destroying it, right? Like it's like, you know, government being like, we're letting you protest as opposed to this emergent protest, right? That sort of thing. Okay, we might have time for maybe one or two more, depending on how things go. Again, I'm just rolling the dice within my own brain from another anonymous person related to the idea of games set up for you to win. How does any high score game relate to this? Roguelikes as well, or any tabletop game with a single winner? Are these better set up for polemic games and ones about uncertain struggle or that sort of thing? You stumped our panel. Okay. We'll come back to that. Adrian asks, how is this related to a plays to lose orientation? I'm not sure exactly what we're referring to, but assume this conversation that has always existed, but maybe has become more prominent as a style in recent TTRPGs like Trophy Dark. So again, this sort of generic move to kind of like, you know, you're going to play a game where you're going to lose. Or how might we relate that to, you know, some of these larger sort of ideological political questions that we've been asking? Why the sudden interests?
I feel like I've been talking a lot. I don't want to step on toes. I do think I think it's worth stating that like I don't know if it's actually sudden. I think that there are a couple of games that have risen to prominence in like relatively similar times, but I'm thinking of games like Bluebeard's Bride that have been around for a few years, and sort of the whole tradition of, especially coming out of the LARP scene, tragic role-playing games where like you are playing fated characters who you know will perish. And I think what the playing to lose ultimately affords. And obviously Bo Ruberg has a whole chapter on this. I've talked about this a little bit with Hades, but it completely reframes the locus of play, right? When you understand that your characters will die, and that's a fixed certainty, the questions change. So Bluebeard's Bride is a great example of that. Everybody plays the same character, a bride who's in the house of her new husband and slowly understands that he kills all of his brides one by one. And at the end of the game, no matter what you do, she will die. And so the question instead becomes, what kind of a bride are you and your friends going to become, right? Do you become a shattered bride who like tries to make herself perfect for her husband who's going to kill her? Or do you try to fight it? Like the way that it reframes play to focusing in on the moment and letting this thing be a contained entity that you're then going to destroy, and the way that that ruptures the game and like gives us opportunities for different kinds of play that leak out from that. I think a lot of designers are really interested in experimenting with that right now. And also I think it's a big, political middle finger to the traditional power game of fantasy RPGs with a Darwinian cycle of becoming increasingly powerful, increasingly better, increasingly resistant to any kind of danger.
Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I tend to totally agree. I was thinking as you were talking, PS, about the Deep Forest, right? Avery Alders and Mark Diaz-Truman's riff on A Quiet Year, where they are expressly like, this game is not played to be won. In a year, the humans are going to come back and probably kill all the monsters, of which you are the monsters. This game is about messily deconstructing the process of decolonialism and figuring out how to navigate it as individuals, disassembling a system that you have been made to be a part of for generations. And I think that explicitly educational or generative process, at least, I'm not an historian of it by any means, has become a little bit more explicit in games that I've seen, where they're not about accumulating and eventually overcoming and going into fantasies, as they are about, this is a process of learning, explicitly so, like making known what we've known as game scholars for a while now, that we don't just leave the table when we leave the table.
Amazing. We are at time. And so again, thank you everyone for your attention. Another round of applause and hurrahs for our participants. And I'm going to stop recording.